They told you stories about cowboys, sheriffs, and outlaws, the shootouts, the saloons, the gold rush, and the dream of freedom out on the open frontier. But what they didn't tell you is where the bodies went. They didn't mention the graves that were emptied in the middle of the night, the cults that built entire towns in the desert and vanished without a trace, or the railroad companies that made backroom deals with hired killers to wipe entire communities off the map. The truth is, the American Old West was far more brutal, far more disturbing, and far more complex than the movies ever dared to show. This isn't the romanticized version. This is what was buried, erased, and quietly forgotten. These are the dark secrets of the Old West you were never meant to know. Number 1. Cannibalism on the frontier. The image of the Old West usually brings to mind dusty saloons, poker games, and shootouts under the blazing sun. But one of the darkest, least discussed realities of frontier life was the disturbing frequency of cannibalism. It wasn't always a dramatic, isolated horror story like the infamous Donner Party. It was, in truth, a survival tactic born from isolation, brutal winters, and a total lack of support from the outside world. Settlements were scattered across vast, unpoliced wilderness. Supply lines were unreliable, and blizzards could cut a community off from the nearest town for months. People didn't just starve, they went mad from hunger. And when animals died off or dried goods ran out, neighbors started watching each other a little differently. In these extreme situations, moral codes collapsed fast. In some areas of the Rockies and Sierra Nevada, it became an unspoken truth that if you traveled through the wrong snowstorm or got stuck with the wrong group, your odds of making it out alive depended entirely on your ability to become the predator rather than the meal. There's an 1868 case from a mining camp near Lake City, Colorado, where 6 miners vanished during the winter. When the snow melted and someone finally made it out, only one man was left. His version of events changed each time he told it. First, he blamed a fight over food. Then he said they simply died one by one. Later, it came out that the bodies had been butchered, their bones boiled for marrow, some even burned for preservation. This wasn't the only incident like it. It just happened to be one of the few where the survivor walked into town alive and didn't hide what he'd done. Even more unsettling, there were no real consequences. Cannibalism wasn't always treated as a crime. If anything, it was quietly accepted as a frontier fact. Law enforcement was virtually non-existent in remote mountain towns, and in places where survival outweighed justice, the locals often turned a blind eye. There were rumors that some individuals developed a taste for human flesh and sought out stranded groups intentionally. A few names were whispered in nearby towns, men you were told to avoid if the snow started falling, and they offered you shelter. Cannibalism on the frontier wasn't a myth or a legend exaggerated by stories over time. It was something real, hidden behind the politeness of silence, buried in frozen ground, and known all too well by the people who lived far enough from civilization that no one came when they screamed. Number 2. The Wild West's secret drug epidemic. When people think of the Old West, they usually imagine a bottle of whiskey in a saloon, outlaws puffing cigars, and maybe a mention of opium dens tucked away in a town's Chinatown district. But the reality of substance use in the Wild West wasn't just casual. It was systemic, widespread, and in many cases deadly. Drug use wasn't just accepted, it was a normalized part of daily life. From frontier towns to remote settlements, narcotics weren't seen as dangerous. They were medicine, comfort, escape, and sometimes the only available treatment in a lawless land where doctors were rare and pain was constant. The most common substance wasn't whiskey, but laudanum, a blend of alcohol and opium that was advertised as a cure-all and sold without restriction. Bottles were labeled with flowery promises and handed out like cough syrup. Housewives used it for menstrual pain, insomnia, and anxiety. Children were given it to sleep through long wagon rides or teething. Migrant workers relied on it after 16-hour shifts in mines or rail work. No one tracked dosages, and overdose deaths were often blamed on exhaustion or consumption to avoid panic. Opium dens weren't only tucked away in Chinese neighborhoods, they also popped up in mining camps and trade hubs where addiction quietly grew across racial and economic lines. Cowboys on long drives used morphine to dull the pain of infected wounds and broken bones, especially since medical treatment was inconsistent at best. Some saloons served drinks laced with tonics that contained morphine or cocaine, especially in larger towns like Deadwood and Tombstone, where competition between bars pushed owners to offer stronger, more addictive experiences. And then there were the traveling salesmen, self-declared doctors or preachers selling miracle cures in glass bottles with handwritten labels. One notorious figure traveled across Texas and the Arizona Territory offering a tonic called the Righteous Fire, said to relieve every ailment from back pain to heartbreak. It was actually a mix of cocaine, alcohol, and trace amounts of arsenic. Customers felt energized and euphoric until weeks later when they started losing teeth and coughing blood. By the time any town figured it out, The man was gone, heading west to find his next market of desperate settlers and trusting ranchers. The frontier was built on pain. Physical, emotional, psychological, and drugs were the quiet companions that helped people get through it. But in a place where law didn't always reach and knowledge was limited, addiction went unchecked. And many of the men and women we read about today weren't just tough survivors. They were quietly, hopelessly dependent on the substances they thought were saving them. Number 3, cult settlements hidden in plain sight. While most people imagine the Old West as a land of independent cowboys, saloon shootouts, and gold prospectors chasing fortune, the deeper layers of that world reveal something far stranger: communities built on fanaticism, isolation, and manipulation. These weren't just tight-knit religious towns or peculiar frontier societies trying to survive. Scattered across the territories were settlements that operated more like cults than communities, and their stories were often buried or forgotten because no one wanted to admit how far things had gone under the radar of law and order. In places where federal oversight didn't reach and communication was limited to a rider carrying mail once a week, entire belief systems could flourish unchecked, and some of them turned dangerously extreme. One of the most disturbing examples was a place known as New Zion, a remote enclave in the Nevada desert, deliberately far from stagecoach routes and military patrols. It was founded in the 1870s by a man named Caleb Morin, a failed preacher from the East who rebranded himself as Prophet Caleb. He claimed he'd been chosen by divine forces to build a new holy city and spoke of visions in the desert sky, clouds forming symbols, stars spelling out names. The people who followed him were desperate, mostly poor families driven west by economic ruin or survivors of other failed settlements. Caleb offered structure and certainty, and within a year, over 100 people had joined him. But what seemed like a spiritual retreat quickly became something far darker. Reports from passing traders and the few who managed to escape painted a chilling picture. Caleb demanded absolute obedience and claimed the voice of God dictated his every command. Bibles were burned in public ceremonies. New Zion had its own scriptures, supposedly written by Caleb in trances. Women were forced into divine unions as young as 13, and men who refused to comply were accused of impurity and banished, though few were ever seen again. Those who questioned Caleb vanished. Some bodies were eventually discovered miles from the camp, half buried or hanging from desert trees, marked with strange burn patterns and symbols no known culture could trace. The town operated outside the reach of any government, and by the time rumors reached officials, New Zion had already begun to unravel. Some say a deadly fever swept through the settlement. Others insist a detachment of soldiers was sent quietly to shut it down, under orders that never made the official record. What's left of New Zion today is almost mythological. A partially collapsed wooden church half swallowed by sand, remnants of hand-carved altars, and a series of standing stones arranged in an intentional circular pattern. Locals avoid the area. Older families in nearby towns still tell children not to wander too far into the brush. Some claim the ground there doesn't grow anything, like the land itself remembers what happened. New Zion wasn't the only settlement of its kind. Across the West, other isolated religious sects took hold, some preaching celestial salvation, others promising immunity from the evils of the outside world. One group in the New Mexico territory believed the world would end on a specific day and sealed themselves into caves, only for rescuers to find their bodies weeks later, starved in a ritual circle. Another, led by a man calling himself Father Orion, built wooden towers in the Arizona desert to signal the return of alien gods. These groups were often dismissed as fringe or eccentric, but their impact on those who lived through them, or tried to escape, was lasting and severe. The danger wasn't just in the beliefs themselves, but in the absolute control leaders had over people desperate for purpose in a lawless land. The Old West wasn't just a story of cowboys and crime, it was a stage where unchecked authority could grow in the shadows, under the guise of faith and salvation, leaving behind ruins, whispers, and in some cases, places so cursed even the desert tries to forget them. Number 4, dark deals between railroads and killers. The story of the railroads in the American West is often told like a grand tale of progress, steel tracks stretching across a wild, open country, linking oceans, taming wilderness, and driving the economy forward. But behind that polished narrative lies a truth that's far more violent, calculated, and morally hollow. The powerful railroad companies of the 19th century didn't just lay down tracks, they buried people under them. Expansion meant profit, and nothing stood in the way of that goal. If someone resisted, they were pushed aside, ruined, or eliminated entirely. And much of the dirty work wasn't done by executives or hired surveyors in crisp coats. It was handled by guns for hire, loosely organized thugs, and entire criminal gangs who had standing arrangements with the men in charge. These weren't just isolated cases of corruption. They were part of a systemic pattern. As companies like the Union Pacific and Central Pacific raced to outbuild each other across vast territories, they often clashed with small farmers, native tribes, and competing businesses who didn't want to sell land, give up grazing rights, or relocate. The official process was to negotiate or appeal to Washington, but that took time and sometimes failed. So off-the-record contracts were drawn up, and hard men were paid in gold, land, or silence. Groups like the Farrington Gang or the more infamous Reno brothers were well known in outlaw circles, but what's often overlooked is how frequently they worked as enforcers for corporate interests. The method was simple. A rancher refusing to sell his land near a planned track. His cattle went missing. His barn caught fire. One of his sons was found beaten on the side of the road. If that wasn't enough, a forged legal document would appear, and a local judge, already in a railroad executive's pocket, would rule against him. For native communities, the tactics were more brutal. Entire villages were raised by so-called unknown bandits, who conveniently struck just before rail surveys were conducted. Survivors were either forced into reservations or left to wander, broken and scattered, while the land was claimed by eminent domain. It wasn't just land theft. Competing lines were targeted too. Trains were derailed in remote areas, track supplies were stolen or burned, and construction crews were attacked at night. The culprits were always bandits or local gangs, but somehow the expansion of one particular company resumed smoothly after the dust settled. When government agents started noticing patterns, documents went missing. Whistleblowers disappeared. One former clerk who tried to bring evidence to court was found in a Chicago alley with his throat cut. It was ruled a robbery, but his money was untouched. No investigation followed. That was the message. Speak and you vanish. Even more chilling were the ghost towns left behind. Settlements that refused to cooperate with railroad plans were bypassed or punished. Trade routes shifted, businesses collapsed, and people moved on. Some towns became nothing more than overgrown ruins. Their names erased from maps, their stories reduced to rumor. Others were absorbed by the railroad. Buildings converted to depots, churches turned into warehouses, cemeteries plowed under without a second thought. The truth is, the railroads didn't just conquer the West with steel and ambition. They did it with fear, bribes, and bullets. Their power was so deeply embedded in politics, law enforcement, and media that very few dared to speak out. And those who did often met silent, violent ends. In many ways, the rise of the railroads wasn't just about transportation, it was organized crime in corporate clothing. The tracks they laid didn't just carry passengers and freight. They carried the weight of bodies buried in forgotten fields, the sound of voices silenced before they reached courtrooms, and the echo of deals made in backrooms with blood-stained handshakes. Number 5, body trafficking and black market graves. The darker corners of Old West history rarely make their way into popular media. But one of the most unsettling truths about that era is how human bodies became currency in a rapidly expanding, largely unregulated frontier. While towns were growing overnight and cemeteries filled as fast as bullets could fly, another, a more secretive economy quietly took shape beneath the surface, one built on grave robbing, corpse smuggling, and the systematic disappearance of the poor, the unknown, and the unprotected. What we often forget is that during the 19th century, American medical schools were growing just as fast as frontier towns, and they were desperate for cadavers. Anatomy programs needed fresh bodies for dissection, but few people volunteered their dead for such purposes. That gap between demand and consent opened the door for a market that thrived in shadows. In cities like San Francisco, Denver, and St. Louis, major hubs linked by new rail lines, medical institutions quietly paid body suppliers who worked without asking questions. These suppliers were often former criminals or local men hired to dig up recent graves in makeshift cemeteries, especially those of drifters, prostitutes, Chinese laborers, or unnamed victims of violence. These people were ideal targets. Few family ties, little paperwork, and almost no one to come looking. The bodies were typically preserved in barrels filled with alcohol, then loaded onto freight trains under false manifests labeled wine, chemicals, or laboratory goods. Shipments went uninspected, and by the time they reached their destination, there was no one to trace them back to a specific town or grave. Some funeral homes were complicit. In boomtowns like Virginia City or Leadville, stories circulated about undertakers who buried empty caskets while selling the real corpses to distant universities. In several cases, these same undertakers were caught with extra coffin lids stored in sheds or signs of disturbed graves nearby. But even when people suspected foul play, they rarely pursued it. Death was constant on the frontier. Most people had seen too much of it to risk stirring trouble over someone who couldn't speak for themselves. And the deeper issue was the social divide. Many of those taken belonged to marginalized groups: Native Americans, freed slaves, immigrants, the disabled, or the mentally ill. In some cases, townspeople didn't just tolerate the theft, they encouraged it, especially when the victims weren't white or didn't belong. Even more disturbing were the reports of so-called doctors who traveled between mining towns and camps offering free medical exams to transient populations. These were often poor men and women who worked under brutal conditions and had no access to real healthcare. The promise of a checkup was appealing. But sometimes, they never came out. It was whispered that some of these doctors worked with body traffickers, identifying vulnerable individuals, poisoning them during treatment, then selling their remains. One chilling story comes from Dodge City, where an old hospital reportedly had a hidden tunnel beneath the basement. Nurses noticed patients vanishing during the night, their records disappearing too. According to town gossip, the tunnel connected directly to a wagon route used for discreet transportation. No evidence was ever found, but few people wanted to investigate deeper. The truth is, the value of a human body in the Old West wasn't tied to a person's story, legacy, or name. It was about utility. If no one claimed you, and if no one would ask questions, you could be worth more dead than alive. And while the frontier was a place of dreams and reinvention for some, it was also a hunting ground for those who knew how to profit off silence, darkness, and the brutal math of human anatomy.